The title of this talk was 40 not 50, and I'm sure people are well aware of the fact that for years we've been starting screening mammogram yearly at age 40 and have had some dramatic reductions in breast cancer mortality. And now a new group is recommending we start at 50 and do it every other year and stop at 74. And this group has a tremendous amount of clout, and it may be that the insurance companies over time will start deny payment. So what I want to do is give you kind of a background. The basic question is screening mammography, how often, when to start, and when to stop. And it's a very simple question, but the answers are complicated. So to really put it into perspective, we really have to kind of hit some big picture issues. One is the evolution of breast imaging. There's been incredible progress in the last 50, 60 years of breast imaging. The way we look at whether or not we should start at one age or another, or when to stop, all these things are based primarily on randomized studies. There's no other way you can do it is to except to test it. And I'm going to talk about 4 randomized trials. Then I want to really go into the guidelines from the US Preventative Task Force, explain what they are, and to some extent how they've come to the conclusion that they have, and then why they're wrong. To tell you my bias up front. And then from there, take it to the next step, how we can be more effective in reducing breast cancer mortality. So the history of mammography, just in a brief overview, it started with MD Anderson in the 1950s, Dr. Robert Egan. His goal was to see breast cancers before they grew to the point of becoming lumps. And of course, the concept's pretty simple. Breast cancers start as a mutation, 2 cells growing out of control. They keep growing, growing, growing. At some point, they reach a lump, and then over time, they spread to the other parts of the body. So the theory would be if you can catch them early in their evolution, that they might be more curable than by the time they present with lumps. But you need a randomized study to do that. And so the first study was started in the early 60s. They had 62,000 women randomized. The technology would be considered rather primitive at that time, and yet overall it projected a 30% mortality reduction. It worked only for women in their 50s, and there was really no benefit for women between 40 and 50. So interestingly enough, the women in Sweden got very excited about this, and they petitioned the government, and they said, well, we want every woman in Sweden to be screened with mammograms so we can catch cancers early. And the government looked at the cost of screening, and of course this is a national health system, and so they would have to pay for all of this. But they finally agreed to do it if, in fact, they could prove benefits. So to give them incredible credit, they invested very heavily. They went out and hired a Hungarian MD, PhD, who had specialized and done his PhD thesis on mammographic imaging technology and how to improve it. He was very science-oriented, and he was able to recruit a team of scientists and epidemiologists to design the study and to evaluate the study and ultimately report on the study. And the study is the largest study, and it's the longest studied available. It's out to 3 decades now. There are 130,000 women, and they were very rigorously randomized, either get a mammogram or not get a mammogram. And after 30 years, they demonstrated an overall 36% mortality reduction, but 26% in women between 40 and 50. And the study is really quite important, and the survival curves over 30 years are pointed out here. But one of the things it shows, it takes 5 or 6 years before the curve separates. So the upper curve is passive screening, and the other is active screening. So the dotted line is the benefits, lower mortality rates. And see that the line is continuing to go up, so the benefits continue over time, and this is going out 30 years. And the most recent randomized study came from Canada, and I'm going to refer to this as the Pan-Canadian study, or the second Canadian study, as opposed to the next one. I'll talk about the first Canadian study. This started in 1990, so they had pretty good equipment. They looked at age 40 through 74, and they reported it just a few years back. And they found a 40% overall reduction The range was from 20% up to 59% mortality reduction, and age at entry, the 40-year-olds did just as well as the 50-year-olds. So it kind of, you can see this progress as imaging technologies get better, that they get more able to, better resolution, they're able to pick up smaller, more subtle, earlier cancers, and this translates into mortality reduction. So this comes at a time when we're making major strides forward in cancer overall. Joe Biden is talking about this moonshot that the summit is tomorrow, so this is an updated report. But the goal was to eliminate cancer as we know it. So the three issues they wanted to focus on were 1, early detection, 2, access to treatment, and then finally, research. So at this very same time, another government committee, the US Preventative Task Force, is saying start mammogram screening at age 50, do it every other year, and stop at 74. It seems ironic that just as we're making this amazing progress, we're making it what looks to me to be like a step backwards. So just to tell you a little bit about the US Preventative Task Force, it's a government-appointed committee of volunteers. It's primary care physicians, specialists were not invited to this, and all their deliberations are in private. So you really can't come to grips with how they come to these conclusions, which is a bit disturbing. The goals of this task force are, as they say in their website, they want to give primary care physicians evidence-based guidelines. And as you know, the first thing they came out with was the PSA guidelines, and then the guidelines on pap smears and colonoscopy, and there's been quite a few others, but those three were the ones that I think we're all most familiar with, and there's a lot of controversy about each one of them, and sort of a tendency for them to back off from standard recommendations. So one of the questions I wanted to answer is, what is their motivation? And in their description in their website, they say that cost containment is not an issue. They try to make that quite clear. And yet, there's evidence that I think that they are driven by cost containment. Certainly costs are spiraling out of control. The government wants to do something about it. But in the meantime, we've enacted the Affordable Care Act, and 15 million people are now insured that weren't insured, and a lot of those people are going to want to get mammograms. Right now, they get them free, and there's no co-payment. So interestingly enough, something that I was not aware of, the insurance companies only are required to pay for procedures if they meet level A or B evidence. And the US Preventative Task Force, after studying this issue, decided that screening in the 40s was level C evidence, which in essence gives the insurance companies an excuse not to pay. And it gives the government less cost to pay to cover the cost of screening. They give level B evidence for 50 and over. Now, how they do that, they just don't give they don't tell you how they've come to that conclusion. That's just their conclusion, and we're expected to live by it. One of the ways of looking at what can happen based on what we know about screening mammography and the effectiveness is that if we take women who are currently at age 30 and we have them start screening every other year at 50, not at 40, there will be 100,000 women who will die unnecessarily. That may be a high estimate, but it certainly is going to have a major, major impact on survival. So the question is, even though they don't lay out specifically how they've come to this conclusion about level C evidence, they do have to provide some justification for their conclusion. As it turns out, virtually everybody, these groups that are pushing for starting mammograms at age 50 point to a first Canadian study that was reported about the same time, just a little earlier than the second study that showed a 40% mortality reduction. This study was funded by the Canadian government, and it was designed primarily to see if mammograms work in the younger age group, because again, Canada's national health system, they didn't want to pay if it didn't work. And it was a pretty large study. It started in 1980, 90,000 people, age 40 to 59. So they dealt with a relatively young age group. What they found after 25 years was a shock. They found virtually exactly the same number of deaths in the mammography arm of the study as a screening arm. So every other study has shown at least a 30 20% plus mortality reduction, they found 0 or less than 1%. They also stated that 22% of the cancers that were identified in the mammography arm of the study underwent unnecessary surgery. In essence, the tumors would have disappeared spontaneously had they not been mammogrammed. This is an incredibly misleading and actually dishonest conclusion. It turned out that there was exactly, out of 3,000 in each group, there was 117 more cancers in the group that underwent screening. Now, there's always going to be more because in the mammography group, you're detecting cancers that aren't yet palpable, so you're catching them earlier, so you always have a few more. But what's really disturbing about this study, if you look at it and refer to the abstract, is very simple terms. They say that this 22% is a ratio between the 117 extra cancers seen on mammography with a denominator of 484. That gives you 22%. But in reality, there's 117 cancers out of 3,133, which gives you a 4%. Now, I don't know how the British Medical Journal got through the editorial board because there's no explanation for this 484. So it seems to me to be an intellectually dishonest conclusion and highly misleading, but it does support their bias that mammograms don't work. This went worldwide. I'm not sure how much you've followed the media on this, but it was on every media source. It was on talk shows. It was on the front page. This is just one article from the New York Times, but there were, if you Google this, it were pages and pages of these articles from all over the world, basically saying vast study cast doubt on value of mammograms. One of the people that I listen to sometimes on the news is Charles Krauthammer, and I was just walking through my kitchen, and I heard in the background that Charles Krauthammer is going to be talking on the new mammography study. And so I figured, well, he's a doctor and he's smart as heck. He's going to really figure this out. So I kind of rushed over there and got up in front of the television, and Krauthammer came out and he was being interviewed by Bill O'Reilly, and he said, well, we've got the definitive study on mammography. We know now that mammography doesn't work. It causes more harm than good, and 22% of cancers will disappear spontaneously and are being currently overtreated because they're being identified on mammograms. I couldn't believe it. It was like a low point in my life. Felt like somebody kicked me in the gut. I said, geez, you know. So then I waited. Well, so O'Reilly says they're fair and balanced. So the next guest, I figured, would at least comment on some of the studies that shows that, well, you know, those 3 studies I've shown you. Nobody. I think they assume Krauthammer is an M deity and he doesn't have to respond to criticism. At any rate, it was very upsetting. So let me just 2 things on this. I want to explain the issue of spontaneous regression, because when people are talking about this 22%, the question, well, where do they all go? You know, you got extra 22% that you're treating. If you don't do mammograms, you had the same number of deaths. 22% of patients, according to them, using that number, is really 4%. In theory, if you believe the 22%, you've got to figure out how do they disappear. So there is a concept of spontaneous regressions. We know melanomas, renal cell carcinomas, some leukemias will disappear without treatment. The definition of spontaneous regression is partial or complete disappearance of a malignant tumor in the absence of treatment. The incidence of spontaneous regression for these tumors is somewhere in the range of 1 in 100,000. So to say 22% is beyond imagination. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Their own data doesn't make sense. So there's never been a spontaneous case of a breast cancer, and we've had 40 years of experience with millions of breast cancers, ever disappearing. There's no documented case in the entire literature. There's no case of a breast cancer getting smaller. There's a large number of cases of breast cancers, low-grade cancers, staying stable for many years. But if you follow them more than 5 or 6 years, they tend to undergoing explosive growth because they mutate over time, and then they speed up. But to indicate that you can explain this finding because the 22% disappear is really a stretch of the imagination. So the alternative explanation for why the Canadian study didn't work, is that the study is flawed from the beginning. And I would like to give you some supportive evidence why I think the overwhelming evidence is that it was a flawed study. So there's two things that they did that were unusual. One, it was a double randomization, and I'll explain that because it's quite unusual. And secondly, they started with substandard equipment and poorly trained radiologists that really weren't up to speed. So let me just go over those 2 points in a little bit more detail. So in randomization, the key is to have an arm's length process where you put patients in one group for one kind of treatment and another control group that doesn't get the treatment. And so you use something that will divide the group totally arm's length. So you might take social security numbers that end in an even number, go into group A, they get the mammogram, and those that end in an odd number go to group B, don't get a mammogram. So that's an arm's length randomization. Every randomized study emphasizes the importance of how the randomization was done, because the validity of the study is based on how well patients were randomized. So this study was very interesting. They did randomize people coming in according to the date that they entered. These are all volunteers. But in this case, something was done that's never been done in any randomized study in the history of randomized studies. Every patient was examined by a nurse. They knew in advance who had palpable breast cancers and who didn't. So the nurses were left with a bit of an ethical dilemma. So you find a woman with an advanced cancer on your exam, and you know if she goes to the mammogram group, she's going to get treated right away. That's the way the study. The others went back to usual care in the community. So they would have to go through their primary care doctor and run through a bunch of hoops to even be seen. And so as it turned out, there are several indicators that what happened was that women who had palpable breast lumps, had obvious cancers, would go into the mammography group. The nurses who were doing the randomization had the ability to shift groups. And that one area that they actually put into their paper, they showed 24 locally advanced breast cancers, very large cancers, lymph nodes involved. 19 of the 24 went into the mammography group. They also looked at survival rates for the first 10 years, and the average 10-year survival rate in Canada was 70%. It was 90% in the group that didn't have the mammogram. So they were obviously selected out to be a more favorable group, and it was only about 60% in the group getting the mammogram, who got the mammogram. So the survival was much lower because they were putting more advanced, established cancers in that group. So if your randomization is no good, most studies would be thrown out the window. But this study got published in the British Medical Journal. And I just don't, between their 22% over triage, which makes no sense, and then a randomization process that's highly flawed, but it gets worse. One of the people that was in the program design, who was absolutely motivated to have a study to see if it's worthwhile to screen women in their 40s, was Norman F. Boyd. And he's a senior scientist at the Princess Margaret Cancer Center, and he's an early architect of this study. And he published a paper in the Radiology, and said, and this is a quote, "The results of these trials should not be used to change the prevailing scientific view of the potential benefits of screening with mammography." In other words, don't trust the study. This is from a guy that designed and signed off of it because he said, I'm not going to be part of the study. That's a pretty damning statement. So it goes further. The study looked at, they had used equipment. It didn't have the proper grids. They actually had hired the 4 top mammographers in the world: Laszlo Tabar, who did the Swedish study, Wendy Logan from New York, Daniel Kopans from Harvard, Stephen Feig, who's now here at UCSF. These are the biggest names in breast imaging in the United States and Sweden, of course. And all of them resigned from the study because of the quality of the mammography was so poor it was unreadable. And so it tells you a little bit more about just how poorly the study was designed. So then the question is, first of all, how does a study get into print? How does the media accept it hook, line, and sinker? And why is there no balance? There's nobody reporting. I can't answer those questions. But what I can answer is how the people who are promoting starting at 50, what is their rationale? And of course, the first statement they make is there's a lack of mortality reduction, pointing to the Canadian study. So they obviously have to accept that study hook, line, and sinker to make their point. Secondly, they talk about overdiagnosis and overtreatment. It kind of goes along with this 22% over diagnosis. And then there's the issue of the false positive and emotional distress. And then the final issue that they point to is the issue of interval cancer. So let me take all four of those and kind of break them down into component parts. So overdiagnosis is the identification of a breast cancer that would not become clinically evident in a woman's lifetime. So let's say we have an 80-year-old lady and we get a little calcification on the mammogram and we biopsy and it's DCIS. The reality is that cancer is not going to kill her. Even a low-grade invasive cancer is probably not going to kill the average 80-year-old, but in some cases it will, and it's so easily treated. So you can make a case for overdiagnosis, and we at the center are very sensitive to not overtreating elderly patients with low-grade cancers, and we just do a limited outpatient surgery and put them on tamoxifen or Arimidex. So we treat them not the same way we would treat a 40-year-old that has the same problem. Now, this concept of overdiagnosis, overtreatment is not valid for women in their 40s to 50s. Even the low-grade cancers, these women have 40, 50 years to live. Even the low-grade DCIS or low-grade invasive are going to progress over time. And we know that that's the natural history. Now, if a woman gets hit by a Mack truck a year after she has a mammogram and dies, the mammogram didn't do any good, or she ends up with heart disease and dies. But that's not really a relevant concept. I mean, we have to assume, we don't have that information. We have to treat everybody as though they're 40, that they have 40 or 50 years to live. The other big issue that the proponents, particularly the task force proponents, point out that's problematic with women in their 40s is they have a higher incidence of false positive biopsies. What is a false positive? You get a screening mammogram, there's a spot, some calcifications, whatever. They do a biopsy and it comes back fibrocystic. It comes back completely benign. And so you say, well, the woman went through all this anxiety, this stress of having a biopsy, and yet it ended up not having any benefit. And they say younger women have a higher incidence of this. What they fail to mention is that the age you start screening is the age where you get these false positives. So if you start screening at age 50, these women will have no previous mammograms to compare to, so when the radiologist sees a spot, they're more inclined to biopsy. So if you delay it from 40 to 50, you still have the problem of a high number of false positives until you screen that population over a series of years. So one of the great ways that our imagers avoid doing a biopsy is to have the patient get their old films. And if that area of concern was there 3 or 4 years ago and it hasn't progressed over time, then you can observe that patient. So it really isn't a very logical argument. And the anxiety issue, they talk about the anxiety of going through a false negative biopsy. One of the issues they don't address is the anxiety associated with the delayed diagnosis, the need for chemotherapy, radical surgery, and radiation. So I think this issue of anxiety is incredibly overstated. We deal with patients with this all the time. Yes, they're anxious, but they're also very relieved to find out everything's okay, and they understand that, you know, some of the biopsies are going to be false positives. The last issue they deal with is the concept of interval cancers, and this is a really important issue, and they're right on this one, but they're wrong on their conclusions. To some extent, mammograms are particularly good at picking up slow-growing cancers. They either calcify or they form a density and the body reacts to the density. The real fast-growing cancers just pop out of the blue, and they don't oftentimes show changes on the mammogram. So these tend to be the more aggressive cancers, the faster growing cancers, and these kind of cancers are more common in women in their 40s and 50s. So rather than saying we'll go to every other year at 50, every other year for an interval cancer is kind of the dumbest conclusion imaginable. If you would want to do it more frequently, not less frequency if you're worried about interval cancers. So the goal should be is to recognize that mammograms have their limitations. And if we're going to improve mortality rates to less than 40%. If we want to get 70, 80% survival rates, we've got to go to different technology. It's something that adds to the mammogram. So one of the first thing that's new and hot out there is a 3D mammogram. Ultrasound screening and MRI screening are all things that give us the option to find cancers that are missed on the mammogram and improve survival and reduce the incidence of interval cancers. And then there's also the issue of risk assessment and risk reduction. If we can identify those high-risk BRCA patients that are going to go on and have a high risk of developing cancer and do something about it and reverse that trend, prophylactic mastectomies or tamoxifen or very vigorous screening, we're going to pick up a lot of those cancers earlier and avoid the problem of interval cancers. So let me just run through some numbers. The 3D mammography is, we were kind of doubtful about this extra technology. There are expenses involved getting newer machines, and there's something every year. There seems to be something new you'd like to add, but you just can't add every new technology. Well, this has been looked at now and studied in some detail and reported on relatively recently, and there's a high pickup of cancers that are missed on the mammogram, and these are the potential interval cancers. So one group came up with a 27% increased detection of cancers in women with a mammogram was normal, and then they picked up a hidden cancer. And a lot fewer callbacks, 15% fewer. The test is a little bit more, maybe Dr. Chen can talk about this a little bit more, but the expenses vary, but in general it's a little more expensive, and insurance don't always cover the extra expense. And at first, the initial machinery had doubled the exposure of radiation. It was still fairly trivial, but it was an increased radiation. We know patients are very sensitive to that subject. So the other issue is breast density and screening with ultrasound. So this is an example of a fatty breast. They're the ideal breast. You can see things, and of course this little cancer, you can all see it, but so this is normal glandular tissue, and then this is the cancer lights up like a light bulb. Even I can see that one. So so in a fatty breast, you don't need anything else. But in a dense breast, it's a totally different situation. The cancers, the density is white, and the cancers are white. So they can blend in. And so this is one of the most disturbing things I see in our weekly RADPath conference, is a case where we followed a woman every year. She's done everything right. And lo and behold, 3 months after her mammogram, she feels a lump and she comes in, and the mammogram doesn't show much. We do an ultrasound, and there's a big mass like this. And you say, how could this happen? I mean, she's done everything right, and yet we are seeing interval cancers under the best of circumstances that we have right now. And what we want to do is to avoid that. So let's just a little bit of putting this into perspective. There's a great study reported in the Journal of American Medical Association 2 years ago. This is a 3-year study of women with dense breasts who were given yearly mammograms and yearly ultrasound screening. They picked up 111 cancers in that total 3-year period. 1/3 were seen only on the mammogram. 1/3 were seen only on the ultrasound. Ultrasound screening in women with dense breasts will cut interval cancers more than in half. And it's the best bang for the buck we'll get. We have a law saying we have to inform patients of that, but less than 1% of the patients in Orange County is given this information. And so most of the women and a lot of the doctors are in the dark about this. Now 26% were seen on both studies. At the end of the conclusion of the study, all the women were offered an MRI. Only a small percentage of it took it, but 9 cancers were picked up that were missed on both the mammogram and the ultrasound. So that's about a 10% pickup, a little bit less. And then 11 were found by the physician or the patient. So these are true interval cancers. But think about it. Had they done the MRI on all of these patients, they might have picked up 99% of them. But certainly would have picked up more than they did. So you can find these small cancers when they're curable, but you can't just rely on the mammogram or the physical exam. So really, if you're going to reduce interval cancers, you have to get a little bit more aggressive about both ultrasound and MRI and add 3D. And as we noted, that there's an 8% pickup of cancers when the MRI is done in the face of a normal mammogram and ultrasound. The MRI is more costly. You're going to a tube. They start an IV. They inject gadolinium. It's an uncomfortable position to be in, lying face down, and the insurance companies will only cover for high risk. So speaking of before we get into high risk, let me just talk about the future. There are things that are exciting in the future. The most exciting was the ultra-fast MRI. It's not ready for prime time, but they can do a very quick limited view procedure. I think maybe Dr. Chen can comment on it. It looks very exciting, but it's not ready for prime time. I don't know quite who's using it right now, but it's primarily a research tool. Molecular breast imaging, they inject a system material into the bloodstream and it lights up in the cancer. It's very easy to read, much less complicated than reading the MRI, much easier on the patient, and has very good sensitivities, but they're still working kind of some of the bugs out of it. It's not quite ready for prime time, but you get the impression that there are some improvement of technology, use of less radiation exposure, bring the cost down, and this could become something very valuable in the future. And then the next big issue to talk about is a risk assessment and risk reduction. So we all know about Angelina Jolie. She had a family history she watched her mother die of ovarian cancer. She had multiple aunts with invasive breast cancer. And she's pretty obviously the kind of patient that every one of us would immediately recognize needs genetic testing. I think she was BRCA 1 or 2. She did a 1 or 2. So she was BRCA positive and underwent prophylactic mastectomy. So she's kind of an obvious choice of somebody who to test, but we know there's a lot of indicators that people should be looked at very carefully if they have a family member with early onset breast cancer, bilateral breast cancers, ovarian cancer in the family, multi-generational first, second, and third degree relatives, male breast cancer, and Ashkenazi Jewish heritages are all big red flags for possible hereditary risks. So this is Mary Claire King. She's receiving a Lasker Award for her great work. She was the first to, discover the BRCA1 gene. She's been extremely active in promoting genetic assessment, and she's more recently started an entire campaign, whereas the paradigm now is to find in the community these very high-risk women and test them, run them through genetic testing and see who carries a gene or not. But she's looking at this from a different perspective. She thinks that we should consider testing every woman age 30, or at least give them the opportunity for testing, because she's looking at patients who come in with a breast cancer, say they're in their 40s, so we automatically send off gene testing and they're BRCA positive. She considers that a failure of prevention. Had we tested her in the 30s and found that they had had the mutation, we could have started yearly MRI screening, we could start risk reduction, diet, exercise, tamoxifen, and or prophylactic mastectomy, and eliminate the chance, basically, of getting a cancer. So that's the ultimate way to eliminate an interval cancer. And what Mary Claire King has done is invested in this, or is consulting for a new company called Colored Genomics. And they test for both BRCA1 and 2, plus 28 other high-risk genes at a cost of $249. So I think every doctor in this community should be aware of the advantage. And the way we handle it, when patients come in who are clearly high risk, and we run them through our testing models, and if they reach a certain level based on the NCCN guidelines, the insurance companies will pay for standard testing, and that's $100 out of pocket. But we have a lot of patients that are concerned, particularly mothers who have, maybe their mother had it at age 50 or 60. It's not enough risk to get genetic testing, but they're worried about maybe their daughter has inherited this gene, or their granddaughter may, or their son, of course. So now you can go directly to the web, no doctor referral. You can read their materials, and if you choose to pay the $249, they'll send you a kit. They spit into the kit, send it back in, postage paid. 4 to 8 weeks later, you get a report back. If in fact you have questions, you have an unknown variant, or you have an actual mutation, there's genetic counselors. So they have both physicians on the website to go through the medical aspects before you're tested, and then they have genetic counselors if you have questions. So it's a pretty neat package. And in reality, we're reaching the point, I would think in a decade, where the cost is no longer an issue, and we might end up starting testing at birth. I mean, I think there's just some incredible changes that are going to be taking place in the next decade. So we have our own risk assessment program. It's open to the public. It's very inexpensive. It covers all these bases, but it's got some real advantages. And so wherever you choose to send your high-risk patients, you'll get some important information on these people. One, they'll decide for you, does a patient qualify for an MRI? So if they have more than a 20% lifetime risk based on one of our computer models, then the insurance company will usually pay. They also identify, they know the NCCN guidelines, who qualifies for genetic testing, who the insurance company is going to pay. So that's very valuable. It really removes the burden of testing from the primary care doctor. I mean, who has the time to go through this in the office? And there's so many variables here that the reality is nobody has the time unless you have an organized approach to this. But one of the big things I think it's going to do with this inexpensive testing with color genomics, it'll be a first step in looking for those silent carriers, people who have really minimal reason to be tested, but actually are tested and then end up being positive. There's not going to be a lot of them. We have not reached the point where we're promoting every woman be tested at 30, as Mary Claire King is, but I don't think we're far away from that point. At least personally, I think as long as they're offered, and I probably would offer it at age 25, because I'll explain in a bit, that's when we start screening this age group. So in closing, a lot of information. And we went pretty quickly. Looking at this U.S. Preventative Task Force and giving them every opportunity to explain themselves or to come up with some rationale for why they would start at 50, I can find none. More disturbingly is it's based on a flawed study and a manipulation of the data. It's unconscionable from my personal perspective. I hope somebody in the audience or somebody someday will give me some reason for this, but I think I just can't imagine how they've been able to promote this so successfully to get a worldwide kind of acceptance that 50 is an acceptable age. So at present, they put another delay on this. It was going to go in effect this year, and the insurance companies were going to stop paying, are requiring a co-payment in other cases. But they've delayed it to 2017, and people are trying to delay it further. The American College of Radiology is a big proponent of working with the Senate to try to get them to delay it. But whether they do or not, we don't know unless we get kind of a groundswell of support. And that's sort of what our 40 not 50 campaign is about, is try to get a grassroots support among physician community and among the public to try to stand up to this U.S. task force. Because if something isn't done, the College of Radiology can't do everything. I mean, it's a major uphill battle. So I want to give you just a summary of the guidelines that sort of I think are the ideal guidelines, and you'll use your own judgment, but I think that starting screening for all women at age 40 is the baseline concept. For women with fatty breasts or predominantly fatty, you don't need anything more. The mammogram really works well. For women with dense breasts, and sort of average risk, I think the screening ultrasound should be done every year. Now, there's no absolute guideline saying that should be done. There's a lot of controversy, but it doubles the pickup of small cancers. It seems ludicrous to do a mammogram, have a dense breast, and know that you've missed half the cancer. I mean, how can you? And if the insurance company doesn't pay, I tell my patients, I say, it's the cost of a Diet Coke a day for a year. I mean, come on, we spill that much amount of money. It's so a test that can either make you feel reassured that you're not missing something, or it saves your life. Not a bad investment for a Diet Coke a day. So for high-risk women, we basically, if there's no family history of early onset breast cancer, again, we start at 40. If they do have the family history, we start 10 years earlier than the age of the youngest first-degree relative. So if your mother was diagnosed at 45, the daughter would start screening yearly at 35. And then in those women, we give them the opportunity of either screening ultrasound or screening MRI or alternating. And most of them we really like to alternate. And then there's a very high risk. I had mentioned that a bit earlier on the risk assessment program. These examples would be people with a BRCA mutation, or now we've got 28 other mutations. I can't keep up with them. P10, PALB2 have been in the media lately. The other group we tend to forget about are the girls that were radiated for Hodgkin's in their teens and early 20s. marked increased risk of breast cancer. And they've kind of lost contact with a radiation therapist or pediatrician. They graduate from them, and then they get picked up, and they sometimes forget to even tell their primary care doctor that they've had mantle or radiation. So if you can identify those people, they need to start yearly screening at age 25, mammogram screening at 30. There's a little bit of fluffiness in these guidelines. Dr. Chen might comment on that, but that's just the one I remember that keeps me focused, and that's the number I use when I talk to patients. This isn't just coming from us or BreastLink or surgeons in general. This is supported by the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Now, this is a network of the top oncologists, surgeons, radiologists, radiation therapists in the world. And they have from the top cancer centers and the top physicians, and they create guidelines in exquisite detail that are designed for optimal patient care. They say start the screening at age 40, do it yearly, and for high-risk people, evaluate them carefully and do more aggressive screening. And again, they're not the only ones. The Mayo Clinic is a pretty unbiased organization. They say start at 40. American College of Radiologists, you might expect. Society of Breast Imaging. Then the American Cancer Society is kind of crazy. I guess they wanted to compromise and look reasonable, so they say start at 45. They do say yearly, and they say between 40 and 45, discuss it with your doctor. Well, what the net result of this is, it says, well, the American Cancer Society said I don't have to start at 40, and then there's confusion. It's stupid to say that. There's just simply, I mean, every woman should be aware of the fact that the mammogram's not perfect. So I think we have a duty to say that to any age group. But to divide this thing at 45 just adds one more element of confusion from my perspective. So let me give you my take-home messages. And the one liner I want you to remember: breast cancer is a disease of young women. More years of life are lost for women in their 40s than for all the years of life lost for women 50 and over. So clearly, from a loss of years of life lost, it's more important to start to give more attention to women in their 40s. There was an incredible autopsy study done in Harvard, and all the Boston hospitals contributed, and they looked at women who died from breast cancer, and then they eliminated all the deaths that weren't breast cancer deaths and just focused on those women who died from metastatic breast cancer. In over half of the cases, the diagnosis of cancer was made before the age of 50. How could you start at 50? Women under 50 were more likely to have an aggressive cancer and or an interval cancer. From that same autopsy study, they looked at all the women, looked at their history of mammography. 71% of the women had not had a mammogram in over 2 years. 61% never had a mammogram. So think of our mortality reduction on the population basis if we had 90% of the women getting mammograms. And one of our big problems is the underserved. I think the Affordable Care Act made progress in getting those women in for mammograms, and now they seem to want to dilute that progress. So the final take-home message is I think we look about numbers and we compare this statistic to that statistic, but sometimes we forget the number one woman, one life, one family. And I think we have to put that in perspective when we think about this problem. Thank you. Thank you.